Hey guys, Space Marine 658 here. Today we start a brand new series, and this is going to be a complete how to create a game from start to finish. Specifically, I'm going to be showing you how to create a space combat game using realistic physics, but we're going to cover all of the different parts and pieces you need to truly make a game. And my goal with this is to teach you the correct ways to use Unreal Engine. There's a lot of really good tutorials out there, but there's also a lot of really bad tutorials that don't really show the best ways to do certain things. Now, does that mean I'm never going to make a mistake in this tutorial series? No, so take everything I do with a grain of salt, as you should with any tutorial. But I'm going to show you the best possible way that I know how to do these different things. And to kind of get you started and get you an idea of where we're going to hopefully end up near, I'm going to show you actually where my game currently is, as I'm currently working on it. Now, with this, we're going to cover a lot of topics, from things like intro videos and localization to the actual building of the combat game itself and just sort of the structure that will take. Now with that, there's going to be a lot in this series, so be aware that there is going to be a bit of a target that I try to hit for every single video. When it comes to how in-depth I cover the targets. My goal is to give you the tools so that you can carry the game on from there without creating the entire game for you. So as an example, right, we're going to cover things like input, creating input, setting those up, managing input between different pawns and things like that. But the goal for me is not to necessarily write out every single input piece that you're going to need for this specific game, but instead to give you a general idea of the different input types and actually set a couple of them up so you can see some examples without doing everything under the sun. But with that, we're also going to cover things like audio settings, graphical settings, and controls. As you can see here, here's some inverted controls and different things between controllers and mouse and keyboard. And then with graphics, we're going to cover things like VSync, FPS limiting, graphics APIs. This one's going to be a big one. We're going to be covering how to switch between the different graphical APIs, resolutions, and things like that, and a lot more. If we go ahead and dive into the game, we're also going to cover things like UI, what is the preferred approach for the different UI methods, as well as in-game audio, subtitles, just a lot of different topics. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into creating our project, because starting here today, we need to set up some basic things to truly get ourselves started. We'll go ahead and create a new project. Now, as far as which specific one you select, it's kind of up to you. Personally, I prefer to start with a blank project, and I am going to start with a C++ project because, well, let's start with a blueprint project, since that is something that a lot of you are going to be more familiar with. But I'll show you how to do a lot of things in C++ as well, because this is going to try and show a true depiction of how you should use Unreal Engine, which is not necessarily fully one way or the other. There will be times when you need to be in blueprints and times when you need to be in C++. Now, I know there's some talk about blueprints going away and that is going to move to something like called Verse. I don't know when that's going to be, so for at least the foreseeable future, we're definitely going to still have blueprints around, at least until Unreal Engine 6, which is a couple years away. So let's go ahead and get kicked into here. So we're going to go ahead and put this project somewhere, wherever you want to actually have it saved. For now, I'm going to go ahead and go to my desktop and just create a new folder for this. And I'm going to call this Space Game Project, but you can name it whatever you'd like. And I'll go ahead and save it inside of there. And for the actual project name, I'm just going to call this Space Game. And I'll go ahead and create. So this should create a project with nothing pre-existing in it. All right, so once the engine has finished compiling shaders and you are in there, you're going to see there's a lot going on here. If you've never been in Unreal Engine before, go ahead and look at a few things here. I'm not going to dive too much into the weeds, because I know most of you who've been in the engine before don't need to know this. So we're just thinking about this from the perspective of somebody who's at least used Unreal Engine a few times. So as you can see here, I have an editor diagnostics window up. This should come up by default. If not, you can open it up, I believe under tools. believe that's where it's at least. Let me double check. Yeah, editor diagnostics. But as you can see here, there's a whole lot of stuff going on here. Something you probably don't need to worry about too much, but this can be helpful if you start to run into issues. You can look at a few different options here in terms of what might be going on. Now, in terms of the actual level and stuff, we're not too worried about this because it's the one that just comes with the engine by default. So here in our content folder, this is going to be your base level for Unreal Engine. This is where everything comes from, everything gets stored. This is, ideally where you want to keep everything that is part of your game. Even if you bring in plugins that bring assets, you want to try and migrate those assets into this area because it's sort of the end all be all of where everything is going to live. And with that, when you're first getting set up, you kind of want to think about what structure you want to have folder-wise. The way I like to break it up into at the top level is you're going to have your game folder, and that's going to contain all your game assets, your blueprints, your AI, your NPCs, everything that is related specifically to the things that are going to be in maps in your game. And then I like to have a folder that is specifically just for the actual map files themselves, because that makes it a little easier to kind of flip through the different levels if you have more than one level. Or if you have just one, you don't necessarily have to do this. You could put it in a folder inside the game. That's where I like to let it live. And then here, oftentimes it depends on the specific situation that I'm running into, depending on what exactly I want to do. I might include, a sort of top level folder here for maybe interfaces or something like that. But for this game, because it can be pretty complex, I'm going to put that inside the game folder. So once we step in here, we'll go ahead and create a few folders here. Now, how exactly you set this up is kind of a personal preference. There are recommendations that are inside of Epic's own documentation, but a lot of this comes down to the size of the team, the number of people working on it, if you're working by yourself versus working in a team. If you're working at a company, there's going to be all kinds of different ways that you can set this up. For me, the way I like to think about it is usually I create a top level that includes all the different pieces that I want to have inside of my game. When I'm first going in, I'll only set up a couple of them because I can come back and add more later. But usually I'm going to have a folder for my UI. I'm going to have a folder for maybe NPCs, and that's going to include both enemy and allied. And then I'll have a folder for player things. And then from there, I'll have a folder that is, sort of game instance level. So what I'll usually call this is global or something to that effect, because this is where I'm going to keep things that are important to have no matter what part of the game it's part of. So this might be, inside the global, I might have a folder that's like input, and that's where I keep all my input files. That's where I keep all of my input actions. And then I'll have another one that is the game instance, because while the instance itself is just a single item, I might have other things that are related to or connected to the game instance, like interfaces and things like that. And then usually from there, I'll usually just start adding things as I'm in the game and actually doing things. But yeah, so that's the very basics for setting up the folder structure. You kind of have to decide. I like to decide early on what my folder structure roughly is going to look like and what level of items I want to have. So for example, under UI, I'll probably also have something like main menu, and that's going to cover just the main menu itself and then any assets required for that. And then I'll have another folder for things like settings. And then usually lastly, I'll usually have a assets folder. And this is going to be specifically anything that is part of either these two or is any kind of specific UI element that is an asset that I've imported that's a texture. I like to have the assets all in one folder so I can kind of browse through them and see, what kind of items I have to pick from. From there, there's, that's the basic folder structure set up. Now you're going to want to think about what plugins you might want to bring in. Now, as far as the different plugins that are available, there's a whole ton. I'm definitely going to bring in my electronic nodes, but it's kind of up to you, whatever plugins, if you already have any that you bring in. But these are at least these two right here are my two recommended that everyone has. They're pretty affordable and they're very handy. So you have ZOMS editor add-ons and electronic nodes. They just make your UI a lot cleaner and they give you a lot more tools to move around in the UI. From there, something that we're going to talk about a little bit later is compiling shaders. I use Stage 0. That is one of the ones that I use to compile my shaders. It's currently my favorite and it's the one I recommend. But yeah, that's going to be a little bit later on. We'll talk about that once we get there. And there's also PSI Advanced Tag Display. This is just a UI plugin that I am going to turn on. This just allows me to add color to certain gameplay tags and makes them a little bit more readable. This is not required by any stretch of the imagination. This is just something that I enjoy using. From there, we're going to talk about the plugins that come with Unreal Engine. Not all of them are turned on by default. Specifically, that is to save you some space. In fact, some people even set up entire project settings that disable every single plugin, and then they go in and manually only turn on what they want. I don't think I need to go that crazy because the engine is usually pretty good about disabling or removing anything that's not actually being used. But one of the big things we want to look at are we're going to want to look at our enhanced input and make sure it's enabled, which it is here by default. I believe it started being enabled by default in like 5.6. From there, there are a few other options. Let's go ahead and just search for, we should have as well. I have to go to the top level and then common UI. So from here, I'm going to turn on common UI as well. Even if we're not setting it up here in this episode, it's something that I like to have enabled because I know that I'm going to use it. From there, we'll go ahead and hit restart. It'll take a minute or two. It'll restart the engine and it should be good to go. Yeah, not even a minute, so pretty fast. From there, that is most of the initial setup that's required. There are a few more things we can change in our project settings, but at the moment, these are things that we're going to worry about a little bit later on. So for now, let's start off by just thinking about what we want to do with our player, right? So to get started with our player and sort of, how we handle or control that, there's a few different things we can do. So if we go ahead and look at our blueprint class, right, you can have a player controller. You can have the actual player character, pawn, or actor itself, depending on how you actually want to set up your actual character. And that is something to think about, right? Depending on what type of game you're doing, if you're doing a, walkable game where you're going to have a character moving around in your ship or something like that, you might want to go with the character because it's going to give you a lot of tools to start off with. For our game, specifically the space game, is going to be a pawn because while the pawn itself, is a little bit more simplistic than the base character controller. The thing I like about it is it's somewhat stripped back, and we are going to build other pawns that you can then control. And it's very easy to swap between pawns because then at that point you can use your variables in a little bit of a less deterministic way. So for example, there's something called soft reference variables versus hard reference variables. Now, of course, there's a lot of nuance to them and when and how to use them, and we'll discuss that when we get to those points. But that is something to keep in mind early on, is thinking about what's going to be loaded, when is it going to be loaded, and how critical is it that it is loaded or unloaded. Something to be aware of is, the more things you have loaded at one time, the larger memory footprint your game is going to have. And that can especially be harmful on users with less memory, especially in these memory bandwidth times. So it's definitely something to pay attention to and be aware of. So for now, we're going to create our player pawn, and I'm just going to call this BP underscore player pawn. And something to be aware of when you're creating your characters, because we're going to be talking about how to do things the right way, you need to think about the prefix and the suffix. Most of the time, prefixes are where you're going to be using. There's occasionals where, like, you're creating a material instance where you may want a suffix, but your prefix is going to be very important for helping organize different things. So BP player pawn is blueprint player pawn. That's pretty clear cut. There are a number of ways you could format that title, but this is, from my understanding, the Epic recommended way is the type of blueprint it is. So if it's a widget blueprint, WBP. If it's a regular blueprint, BP. If it's like a string table, it's ST. If it's a struct, I believe it's just S underscore. Things like that. So now if we're thinking about our player pawn, we've got our blueprint created, right? And let's go ahead and drag this up here. Now for us, since we are doing a space combat game, right, we'll want a default scene route. Now the question comes in, what type of collision are you going to be handling? For me, I like to have a simple collision for each piece of the ship, but to have multiple of those so that each part can collide separately without colliding with themselves. Now, there are some caveats to that and some challenges that come in with figuring out where the collision happened. But that is something you can absolutely do. You can break different parts of a ship. In my game, that is a big part of it. There's different systems and subsystems that can be broken during combat. So with that, we're going to make our cube actually our default scene route. By doing so, this gives us a little bit more control over what specifically is being controlled. It's kind of an odd thing to say. But yeah, we're not going to worry about setting this up. This is going to come in a different episode. But this is going to be just our base player pawn. There's a lot of things we can include in here, but for now, we won't worry about that part too much. Let's go ahead and create a new level. Since we are not going to be using this base level that comes with the engine, let's go ahead and create a new level. And for this, I like to do L underscore and then whatever the name of the level is. Since we're going to be doing a lot of early stuff that is, sort of setting up the game, you could call it tutorial or you could call it like test map or something like that. Just something that you're aware of is going to be the base level of the game. As you can see, it comes completely blank with nothing in it, and that's exactly how I want it. From here, we're going to go ahead and go up to here and do a spawn. Oh, I can never remember the name of it. It's going to be here under all player start. Here we go. And I like to start the player off pretty close, if not right at 0, 0, 0. Sometimes you'll notice that you run into bugs that can be caused by something odd like a vector being cleared out and pointing at 0, 0, 0. By putting the player start at 0, 0, 0, it can really help track those bugs down because you'll notice that, whatever's supposed to be pointing out, let's say, at a spaceship far away is instead pointing behind you or right where you're at, and you go, okay, it's very clear that it's not pointing the correct direction. But yeah, and so this will be our player start. We're not too worried about the start tag or anything like that. Auto receive input. We'll say player 0 automatically receives input. And one thing you want to do is in your level settings, there's a few things you can set up. So there's going to be the game mode. You can have a world override. You can have a project override. And then within these, you can also you can kind of break it down. So with this one, you select the specific world. In the game mode project settings, you can actually set, what's the default pawn, what's the HUD, all these different things. Since we've gone ahead and created those, so you can see, can I select classes when game mode is a native class? So you have to create your own game mode to actually edit any of this. So let's go ahead and actually create our own game mode. Now you can use these game mode and game mode base as a parent class, and I usually use the game mode base. And what we'll want to do is go into our game, and since this is a pretty global piece, heck, I'd almost say you could probably put it under game instance, but instead I'm actually going to create a new folder, and we'll call this game modes, because there are times when you'll want more than one game mode, and we'll just call this the tutorial game mode. And we'll give it the prefix GM underscore. So that's game mode tutorial. And we'll go ahead and save. Now inside of here, you're gonna see there's a whole lot of options for things you can set up here. The most important thing is gonna be, we've got our HUD, we've got our pawn, which we need to switch to our BP player pawn. And then there's a few other spectator things like that we're not too worried about right at this moment. So we'll go ahead and compile and save. If we come back here, now we've got our game mode as tutorial. You can see we have our BP player pawn here. If for some reason you change your pawn and you want to set it to something different, now that it's a custom game mode, you can select that here. The HUD class we don't have set up yet, but you could select the HUD class as well as the player controller. Now, when it comes to the player and the player controller, there's a lot of discussion and debate over the best practice. Usually it's generally accepted that the player controller controls the player. With the current paradigm and the way that enhanced input works, I actually disagree. For my own personal taste, I still think there's definitely some validity in using a player controller. But personally, I actually find that it's much easier for me to just have the default player controller and not have anything really in it. And then that player controller more of acts as a, here's where the player currently is. And so from there, it moves around and can move between different pawns. And the pawns themselves then have the controls built into them. So the benefit of having the controls built into the controller is that you can have a unified set of controls that work no matter what type of pawn you're controlling. That works great if your pawns are all the same or just only changing, maybe the look or style of the pawn. For like an FPS game, that works great. Having the controller actually do the commands and tell the pawn what to do works great. For my style of game, because the main player, the main controller is going to be, this one ship, that the ship itself might change a little bit style here or there, but the overall ship is going to be the same ship, and that when you're switching between actual like separate pawns. Having the controls built into the player pawn itself works a little bit better. With that though, there are things that we need to be aware of in terms of how we build our controls for our ship, right? It would be very easy to just start dragging in those input elements and actually just start trying to move the ship inside of our blueprint, but that can lead to the siloing of different control setups and of the actual way your ships move. So with the ships being here handled physically, what I actually prefer to do is use blueprint components. So let's actually go ahead and create some blueprint components. And these are also known as actor components. I'll go ahead and create a new folder. We'll just call this, we'll call it BPC because that's going to be our blueprint components. And we'll go ahead and create one in here. We'll just do an actor component and we'll call this BPC underscore control. Controls? Yeah, controls. We'll call it controls. Now, the cool thing with this, something that is done in my game as well, is that if you set up your actor component correctly, you can actually have this be reused by the AI so that your systems, whatever type of blueprint you have right here, no matter what kind of actor component you build, if you build them in the right way, your AI can use them just as much as the player, which leads to it being a little bit more flexible, a little bit faster to set up AI enemies rather than needing to rewrite all of the code or copy paste all of the code over and trying to finagle it to fit with the AI. Instead, we write it to be as generic as possible so that it fits within the actor component. But yeah, I think that's it for today. In the next episode, we're going to start diving into input and just sort of setting up our basic enhanced input system. And then we'll move on from there. If you have any questions, definitely leave them down below. If there's anything you'd like to see in this series, because we are going to be going from front to back to fully building out a small little space game, definitely let me know. But otherwise, good luck and good hunting.